Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today, we're going to discuss environmental justice and climate equity. Justice and equity. These terms are often used interchangeably, but they're really not. The International Bar Association defines justice in this context as the legal and procedural rights relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Equity, on the other hand, is the equal application of justice and other environmental benefits to everyone, regardless of income, race, or other characteristics. Equity works to balance access to resources while protecting vulnerable communities from environmental hazards. Yet environmental hazards are consistently placed in poor communities. Toxic waste dumps, CAFOs, chemical plants, even highway projects. And policies aimed to improve the environmental issues often spread costs and benefits unevenly across different groups. Experts acknowledge that climate change will disproportionately affect low-income communities, and that's those communities least responsible for climate change. We're joined today on Zoom by Beto Lugo, Executive Director of Clean Air Now. Hi, Beto.
Hello.
Jacqui Patterson, Executive Director of the Chisholm Legacy Project. Hi, Jacqui.
Hi.
Jellie Duckworth, Climate Equity and Community Engagement Strategist with LivZero. Hi, Jellie.
Hi, Bob.
Omar Muhammed. Is Omar with us? I see he's connecting now on Zoom. Omar, you're muted and camera's off.
Give me 1 minute.
We are recording. So Romona Williams, Executive Director of Mississippi Communities United for Prosperity. Hi, Romona.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'd like to start by going around the room and letting each of you talk about the issues your group addresses. Jacqui, can we start with you?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks again for having me, Bob. So the Chisholm Legacy Project, it's the full name is the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. And as you talked about in your opening remarks, we recognize the disproportionate impact that that environmental injustice, climate injustice has on BIPOC communities and low-income communities as well, and BIPOC meaning Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. And our work with the Chisholm Legacy Project is coming out of the work that I've done for the last 12 years with the NAACP as Director of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program, and really recognizing some of the unique both challenges and the unique ways of organizing and building power and self-determination with Black communities. And so the Chisholm Legacy Project works with and works in service of Black communities, and also works in movement with BIPOC communities more broadly. But our work is on building capacity and building self-determination and supporting Black community self-determination. So it's everything from working with communities like Sam Branch, Texas, where it's a freedmen settlement that hasn't had running water since its inception and emancipation. And so working with them to develop action plans. How do they take the reins from having a situation over these years where they're reliant on people to bring donated bottles of water every Saturday to their local church in order to have water to drink and cook with and bathe and clean with? Sorry. And so our work with the Chisholm Legacy Project is to make sure that communities like that are able to really, again, have the reins of what happens in their communities going forward. And we know that they're not alone. So we're also working with other communities that find themselves in similar circumstances. In addition, we are working with the movement, helping the broader climate justice movement to address its issues around anti-Black racism and to be able to incorporate racial justice more strongly in their broader climate justice agenda. So providing racial justice analysis, providing policies that is sensitive around racial justice issues. And I'll just wrap with saying also working with mainstream organizations that are working on climate and environmental issues to deepen their understanding around JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, so that as we try to shift resources so that they're more shared with frontline communities, we also recognize that as it stands, they still are getting the lion's share of the resources. So at the very least, we want them to understand how they can do better by, with, and in service to our communities. And then the fourth foci is working on Black femme leadership. So Black women and other folks who identify on the female as female, we see how so often Black femmes are holding down so much of the movement, holding down their families, holding down their organization, their communities. And as we saw in Alabama and Georgia, holding democracy in terms of, and so much on the shoulders of Black femmes. And so our work is really not to help them to work harder or work more or work better, but to help them to be held as they do the work that they do. So providing access to resources around life coaching, job coaching, executive coaching, access to respite and restoration retreats and residencies, access to healing, justice, resources, and otherwise. So I'll wrap there, but that is our work in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you. Jellie, tell us about the issues that you and your group work on.
Sure, thank you. And Jacqui, that's amazing to hear about your group. So thank you for sharing. So LivZero is kind of a baby that birthed from a lot of my work on the ground as a community organizer and specialist in community engagement and making sure that we were creating democratic processes so that communities were not only in the process of creating and implementing, but also benefiting from the programs and policies around climate, and specifically making sure that we were looking at intersectional issues. So we really take a health and cultural equity standpoint when we look at the climate crisis and how we approach that. So it goes beyond just stopping at race. Starting at race. We don't stop there. We really go into the cultural aspects of it too. So with that being said, it's more than just, looking at BIPOC and those situations, but also understanding the historical systemic barriers that have hurt all people, whether that is religious, whether that is based on their sexuality. And so a lot of those other intersections really matter when we're looking at overall, not only data, but also how we engage and we're really inclusive of all communities. And so we work primarily with frontline communities, those who are experiencing, and we take a very asset first approach, meaning that we go into the community saying, you are an asset, you have strengths, before we say you're a community that has been marginalized and has issues. And I think that is something that we constantly get away, or we get too wrapped up in, is saying historically marginalized communities. There's recognition in that, but we also want to recognize the power that is already existent within the community. So really just to build capacity and momentum, working with community-based organizations and municipalities to strengthen their work and their approach to look more holistically at the climate crisis from a health and cultural equity lens. And so I help train organizers, primarily build leadership, female leadership in this space. BIPOC female leadership in this space is really important. Wanting to use equity as a conduit to getting towards justice, but also changing the storytellers and changing the leadership. So that's really the essence of LivZero, and the work that I do is still very much on the ground, but also supporting that with data and now moving policy. So yeah.
Well, thank you. Omar, welcome. Glad you could join us. Tell us about the work you're doing, the issues, and the Low Country Alliance for Model Communities.
Yes, thank you again for having me. The Low Country Alliance for Model Communities work on revitalization of low wealth communities. We primarily work in 7 communities in the city of North Charleston. We focus on 4 core areas: affordable housing, economic development, education, and environmental justice. And the strategies that we use empower communities, right? We tap into the resources and the power that already exist in communities and help them to amplify their voice, to seek the change that they want to seek. Our work also centers the community voice in a lot of the work that we do. The community engagement aspect of our work centers the community in that work. We also provide numerous trainings to our residents to help them build their capacity to become the advocates of change that they seek.
Thank you. Romona?
Hi, yes, my name is Romona Taylor-Williams, and I am the Executive Director. We just recently went through a name change to Mississippi Communities United for Prosperity. In 2018, our organization, well, actually the community, Duckhill, Mississippi, we received a grant from the Southeastern Sustainability Directors Network to create a model for sustainability and equity in rural Mississippi. And the name of, we coined the motto ACEEDS, which stands for Achieving Sustainability Through Education and Economic Development Solutions. And we used EPA's 7 elements of collaborative problem solving for our community engagement work, engage residents in extensive listening projects to hear what they saw or what they felt were the top priorities to address from a sustainability and an environmental justice perspective. This particular community had been flooding for many, many years, and flooding was their top priority of a problem to solve. So we designed a program that would mitigate the flooding using gray and green infrastructure technology. And we focused on youth development. We were also chosen by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to build out a model for community and youth leadership development. Out of that process, our partners were Urban Institute and Community Science. And as the fellows that participated in the Leadership Institutes represented 6 counties, which caused us to expand our work and our footprint into 6 counties versus 1 county, which is Montgomery County, which was our original name, Montgomery Citizens United for Prosperity. So our focus is centered on community organizing, educating around climate change and environmental justice. Often in small rural areas, residents do not understand that the issues that they are dealing with, like flooding, for instance, that those issues are the direct result of climate change. So we focus on empowering communities through planning and design and bringing solutions to the problems that the communities have identified. So with this funding from the Southeastern Sustainability Directors Network, we were able to mitigate the flooding, stop the flooding. The town of Duckhill no longer floods. And we also have created a comprehensive, kind of like a hybrid STEM program for the youth. And we call it the ACEEDS Creek Rangers program. And our youth, the program has gained national recognition. So we are now looking, and we'll be partnering with Omar to launch a year-long intensive training that will assist residents to be able to create community-driven climate assessment and vulnerability, climate assessment and resiliency plans. So we approach environmental justice and also climate justice through the lens of community and economic development. Because bottom line, Poor communities, poor folks don't like being poor, and they want their communities to be healthy, thriving, and sustainable, just like all other communities and communities of affluence. So by bringing together strategic partners from across the board, planners, architects, engineers. This afternoon, I had a meeting with a park, a recreation designer, bringing all of those partners and pieces together so that we will be able to design communities in small rural areas, in particular in the Delta of Mississippi and Central Mississippi, so that we can have healthy and thriving communities. And that's kind of like what we do in a nutshell.
Well, thank you.
And we also
Beto.
focus heavily on moving public policy.
That's excellent. We certainly need that. Beto, tell us about Clean Air Now.
Yeah, hi. So thank you for inviting me, Bob. So yeah, Cleaner Now has been around for a number of years, really a grassroots organization, started out of a neighborhood, community members concerned about their health and fossil fuel related air pollution from diesel exhaust, but also from the industrial and chemical plants nearby their home, fenced into their home. So really concerned around those issues, and also knowing that these communities, even though they were concerned, their families also work in these industries, right? So it's one of those approaches that when we think about climate justice, that we really need to think about it holistically, because it's not just the facilities, it's also the workers and how we transition into cleaner jobs, right? Into a just transition. But the organization, I can tell you that has had an impact in the region since its inception. I can tell you that through the organizing that happened early on, we prompted an EPA study to look closer at some of the localized emissions. However, it wasn't a health-related study, so there's like that missed opportunity there, right, to really look at that and correlate that to any health data that would be available from maybe one of the local institutions or hospitals in the area. But I can tell you that around that time, other communities were really interested in learning more about these impacts, not just on the Kansas City, Kansas side, but also on the Missouri side. So as we move forward as an organization, our bylaws, are broader for both sides of the state line, but a lot of our focus is really in the communities of Kansas City, Kansas at the moment, fenced into industry that are being harmed on an everyday basis, right? The air quality, the air pollution that they're exposed to every day from the concentrations of heavy duty emission trucks, and then the cumulative impacts of all these other sources of pollution that they're experiencing. So really looking at through that, and also making sure, like Omar and everyone else has mentioned, and Jellie, is that community leads, right? Community-led projects. All of our projects are designed in a way that the community is really the driver behind it, right? They're part of the decision making, and what is it that we need to do next? And with the COVID crisis, we've had to also modify or switch our projects a little bit, switch them up a little bit in the way that how we're going to accomplish them. But I think overall is building those leaders that already exist in the community and making sure they're equipped, right, with the data and the tools that they need to come and sit in these decision-making tables where they're drafting action plans for us, when they're not including the brown and black and indigenous, poor, white into those conversations, right? The utilities are driving a lot of those conversations. So we know there's an urgency, right? As Jellie mentioned, that we need to equip everyone to be able to be the leaders and be at that table, because if not, like, I think we can get into this a little further, a little later, is that, a lot of the infrastructure that is currently being built is always for the most affluent, right? And so we really need to make sure that when we think about environmental justice, it's, the outcome of it is equity, of environmental justice is equity, right? And so when we think about that, we also need to think about, that it's not just air, it's the water, it's the soil, it's everything that's compounded in these communities of color. The COVID crisis hit them harder because they already had these, they already immunosuppressed, they already had respiratory issues happening on top of that. So I'll stop there, but that's a little bit of the work that we do, and we'll also get into policy at the national level. And we're also part of the National Climate Justice Movement. So, I know a lot of the colleagues here, so it's really nice to see a lot of familiar faces here, Jellie and Romona and Omar, everyone, and Jacqui, like we all know each other, and we know that we are here together, to push climate justice. And I just want to add one point. When we think about climate justice, it's not just looking at the forces against us, it's also looking at them internally within our own organizations and making sure that if we're going to be in the front, that our practices within our organizations are also part of that, leading us to those efforts. Because what we can forget is that the practices and programs and policies that exist today have put us in a disadvantage, all of our communities of color. And when we allow organizations that might still continue to look at that, then there could be a problem, right? But we really need to also look at that as we confront the climate crisis together. So I'll stop there.
That's great. And all of your groups are working on these issues and you're working together and supporting each other. So that's a wonderful model. What is the biggest challenge to social equity you're seeing right now? I mean, what is holding that back? Jellie, do you want to touch that?
Just one. Yes, I will be optimistic here. That will keep I'll keep that here. But as I mentioned before, the leadership in this space is extremely important to change. The only way we're going to change the story, change the narrative, or change the way that we do democratic processes is to change the storytellers to the ones who are actually experiencing these things, right? I always tell people there's a level of difference between myself growing up as a first generation Mexican American woman and having different privileges than some of my cousins who are DACA students still, right? There is a difference with that, right? There's degrees of this, and we have to understand too that story needs to be elevated, that the difference that these stories need to be intersectional. And so I having to carve out my own path into this space is not something that I wish on for any other young female, BIPOC professional. I want them to have a pipeline to get into this space and own it too, right? So we get into this space is surrounded by leadership that does not look like us. Therefore, I have lower confidence to speak up about the situations that are going on. I don't always feel heard and seen. And that is all encompassing as well with leadership. And so I think that is a major issue that we really need to focus on, like Beto said, equipping people, right? Equipping and the talents that already exist, right? And also providing a direct pipeline for them to utilize those talents in a real and meaningful way. The thing I love about community work too is that a lot of times when we think about community engagement, I think this may be another issue that I'm dealing with at the policy level, is that community engagement is not prioritized, and they think about that in a very how do I say, not as a rich and healing sense that as it should be taken. It should be taken very seriously. When you bring community into policy development or program development, you're really doing the work of healing communities and all the disenfranchisement that has been, put among them prior to. And so we really need to be looking at community engagement, the stereotypes that come with community organizing. We really need to be changing that, because those are, as we've seen in every social movement, those are the critical issues that have moved the needle forward and have really kept us in democracy. So there's a lot of, I think that all goes back to really changing the narrative, changing the leadership as some of the biggest issues that I have come across within social equity. So,
is this a question of education and empowerment, or are we actually facing objections to empowering these communities? Omar?
I would say it's a little bit of both, right? That those that are in power refuses to share that power. And also, I think that we are challenged to work with each other collaboratively, right? That's in the movement and outside of the movement, right? We just, I think for funding of, the funders, the philanthropic community, they fund initiatives where it doesn't incentivize collaborative work to get out of our silos and work together. So I think you have that working against your community. You have the power dynamics that exist in communities that are working against them. And then, like the previous speaker noted, that there is a resistance for community-led efforts, right? Communities determining their destiny. There is definitely a resistance with that. So I see all of that as challenges as we move forward in this movement, of being able to work across our differences, work across our silos, right? Work across our intersectional areas of bodies of work. And I see opportunities where communities can lead many of these conversations, right? Even within our movement, we don't come with all the answers. We do not come with all the solutions. Allow the community to lead those conversations. We're there for technical support, to open up resources, to open up avenues to partnerships and funding, to be able for them to work towards addressing their issues and concerns. But the community must be out front.
Thank you. You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Jellie Duckworth, Omar Muhammed, Romona Williams, Beto Lugo, and Jacqui Patterson about environmental justice and climate equity. You know, both the Paris Agreement, and everybody here has kind of touched on policy, so let's move in that direction a little bit. Both the Paris Agreement and the recent Glasgow Pact have significant languages addressing justice and equity. And we have a growing body of climate legislation here in the United States, but we also have powerful groups opposed to their implementation. Even groups who support fighting climate change often fail to consider the equity issues. So how effective have these climate agreements been in the past? And is there a better way to address equity going forward? Let's go back to Jellie on that.
You're giving me loaded questions here, Bob. So I'm going to try to be brief and let everybody else touch on that, because it's a big question. Honestly, when we're looking at these new agreements and we're looking at the talk about race and equity and justice, unfortunately, these are conversations that we are just now feeling comfortable with. And so therefore, anything that is going to be suggested has been an afterthought. Unfortunately, it has not been a priority and has not been the front of the issue or the center of the issue, right? And so we have a long way to go. I think that we're making, again, to be optimistic, we are making strides to at least having open conversations about what equity should look like at the policy level. More than just putting in input, though, is again bringing community in the process, creating and implementing and benefiting from these policies. It's more the front end work than the back end, and that's something that needs to change when it comes to these pacts, right? We can't just have specialists be the ones that list out the equity considerations. We have to start with the community. It has to work from the bottom up if we're really going to focus on healing and getting the outputs that we really want. So I think that's what I would say. We still have a long way to go with that. We have people on the ground that have been fighting for that, but it needs to translate into the national and international level.
Romona, policy, is your legislative work working? Or are there challenges? Where do we go forward with legislation?
Well, I am in the South. I'm in Mississippi. Unfortunately, Mississippi is a climate denier state. So we have few policies that we can say are directed at climate change and environmental justice, and practically zero policies from an equity perspective. We are working to build a movement in the state of Mississippi in order to move the needle towards more just and more equitable public policies. On next month, we will be launching our Mississippi Defending Democracy, Education, Environment, and Social Justice Network. And that network will take on specifically the public policy work, looking at systems analysis, ensuring that the systems are responding to the needs of vulnerable and low wealth and BIPOC communities in an equitable and just manner. And where they are not, evaluating the types of corrective measures that we can take and present in order to begin to push the conversation legislatively around climate change. Climate change is very real. It is significantly impacting the state of Mississippi. More attention has been given on around the Gulf Coast area, but it is having a significant impact in inland communities, especially up in the Delta, where flooding is just profusely, and how are the emergency management systems responding to our communities in the event of climate-related disasters? So we have a lot of policy work that we have to move forward with. Omar mentioned organizations working in silos. Well, our mission is to bring organizations together, bring communities together, provide the leadership tools that are needed to educate first and foremost around the issues of climate change, around the issues of environmental justice. How do we identify environmental justice communities? Do communities know that they are environmental justice communities? So that's the work that we are moving towards. But, when you have folks that just simply refuse to accept the reality that climate change is happening, it is not going to happen. It is already happening, and we are in crisis. And how at a international level, such as the Paris Agreement and COP26, Jacqui attended. Jacqui, you attended COP26, didn't you? She attended COP26, so she can speak more to what that whole thing looked like. It was very chaotic from the feedback that I had, but it's bottom line. It's up to us. We cannot rely on the powers that be to protect our communities. We can fight, we can make our demands, but until we create a groundswell of community residents who are empowered, who understand, and who can effectively defend our causes, then we will continue to see folks who don't look like us, folks who don't think like us, and folks who don't live like us making the decisions for us. And we have the goal of becoming the architects of public policy and no longer being the objects of public policy.
So Jacqui, you were at Glasgow, you were there for COP26. Did you feel like the Glasgow Pact addressed social equity and climate justice?
No, I mean, it certainly has some elements in there, but it definitely does not, and it couldn't, given who was at COP and who wasn't at COP. I mean, first of all, with the nation that we had it in terms of Glasgow, there were so many restrictions, or there were all the red countries, and so that list was long, and so the lack of representation. So as Romona and everyone else is saying, the lack of representation meant that the policy or the lack of real equity and justice center reflected who wasn't in the room. And so it had a lack of ambition, a lack of real commitment to the types of actual systems transformation we need to address climate change. And it was because the people who are closest to the problem, who know the solutions, weren't there to put forward. And even to the extent that people were there, there's a power imbalance within the COP process. So the industrialized nations who act as puppets to the interest of industry were there controlling the conversation as always. And so therefore, we just get kind of, not to even call it incremental progress, is probably overstating things. So that's what I would say in a nutshell about the COP.
So here you're saying the affluent communities, the affluent countries are controlling the message and controlling the solutions,
Yes.
which kind of, harkens back to Ramona's comment that, this has to be ground up, from the roots. The communities are going to have to take action, because you can't wait for COP or some treaty to come along and fix things for you. Omar, what's your experience in the legislative field? I mean, do you feel like it's there for you, or is it part of the problem?
I think it is definitely part of the problem, right? And I think that whole process is designed to be slow on purpose. That's why it is important that when we are talking about creating solutions, creating initiatives through policy, those communities, right? The communities that are impacted by climate change, but contribute the least to climate change, need to be at the table to help to shape and inform the policy in the decision-making process. That has to be paramount to get the types of solutions that the community seeks to the climate impact that they feel, disproportionate impacts that they feel from climate change.
Beto, I know you're working Missouri, Kansas, the whole metro area. How's the legislative process working for you in that region?
Well, I think the legislative process here, it's a battle, right? With the legislators here, we are a conservative, mostly a red state. It's a blue state, but heavily red, right? And Missouri is heavily red. And we see in just, to reiterate what some of my colleagues said, the policies and legislations that we want to move forward, right? And that have actually, some that have even been put forward at the national level now, the talk about climate change, and there's these priorities for environmental justice communities, and there's this Justice 40 money, and these overarching legislation that looks good for a big organization that has been kind of like the puppet of government to lead a lot of these policies. But a lot of these policies don't have a direct benefit to environmental justice communities or communities of color. So there's not a way to prioritize those investments in those communities. So when we think about these policies, we cannot wait for government. We have never waited for government. The Justice 40 program is an example of an opportunity, but there's also the opportunity for groups that have never done environmental justice to now say, hey, we are at the forefront of the environmental justice movement, when groups like a lot of us on the call have started with or without any funding doing this work, right? And so the reason I want to mention that is that at the end of the day, the solutions have to come from the community, whether there's funding or no funding, they are going to come from the community. And then I want to touch a little bit about the agreement in Glasgow, whatever just happened. I think that some of the decisions that were made actually put us in a more dangerous path instead of a better path forward, right, to getting us to these ambitious climate goals. And I want to say, for example, there's carbon offsets, and we've known that through different models how this puts more danger on certain communities and other communities of color, shift pollution from one place to another. There's net zero, there's carbon capturing, which is also is also being put forward by the fossil fuel industry. So who's to benefit? The same industries that are causing the climate chaos. And so what we see here in the local Kansas City metro area, that a lot of policies around climate action and net zero and offsets, but with no tangible targets, right? And the people that are drafting, a lot of the people behind the scenes being part of that drafting of those plans are the utilities and the gas companies, which are also part of the problem. So until we can be able to remove them from those conversations, we need them there, right? Because they need to move forward with, just transition green or solar farms, or move to a greener energy. But what I'm saying is that until we move them, to the majority of us that are there, they are going to be an obstacle to the work that we are doing, and they have been. And I think one other thing I wanted to touch on is also the investment again. Like I said, there's all this money destined for a lot of EJ communities. However, we already know that local government and local NPOs are lining up to get that money. And guess where they're gonna prioritize where wealth already exists, where they can put a charging station with no issues because they know that a person that lives around the corner has an electric car that might benefit from it. They're not thinking about the poor communities where we have been advocating for no emissions from as many facilities as possible, and putting those resources there where they need it the most. They need the transportation because we haven't invested in those communities either with public transportation. And the heavy concentration of trucks is another example of how all this, it's concentrated in communities of color, and there's a lot of priorities around across the country to go to zero emissions around the trucks. However, none of them have a tangible policy that says directed to those communities, right? So it's not just the communities, it's the workers. So a lot of our work, a lot of us here collectively, is also additional, right? Identifying those other policies that we can put in place to make sure that we're not just offsetting pollution because we are still depending on a power plant in the same neighborhood, that we're able to look at it holistically and tackle it all at once. So I'll stop there.
So a lot of our listeners, I mean, they may not be connected to the community or understand these equity issues. How do we engage them? Speaking to our listeners, what would you tell them they need to do and can do to make a difference? Jacqui, do you want to start?
Sure. Super briefly, I'll say, yeah, I mean, so everyone has something that they can bring, and I know that you have a lot of different listeners in different places doing different with different capacities. And so whether it can be as small as just starting a conversation at dinner, where we're raising awareness and starting the dialogue about what it really means to affect the changes that we need in this world. It can go to putting oneself in service to frontline communities. So if you have an EJ organization in your community that you can volunteer with or support in some way, or if you can, we're in this virtual world now, so you don't have to be physically present with someone to support them. So if you're able to reach out to any of the groups on this call, and say, what can I do to help? Like you never know what talents you might have to bring to bear on a situation, and really supporting the frontline leadership of frontline communities. Starting to think about one's spending choices. Some of these companies that are doing the most harm, they stay in business because we support them. The economy supports them. So we need to start really thinking about that type of spending, and how what we're investing in. So everything from thinking about how do we, if you have options to buy energy through clean energy sources, or even, so again, from each according to their abilities. But those are a few things to think about. Certainly joining one's local group, joining a group virtually and putting oneself in service to it, starting a conversation, whether it's at dinner or in your workplace conversations, or on social media, sparking some thoughts on social media, starting to read some of the work that's happening in frontline communities and what's happening with communities to really get oneself educated. So even as you're sparking those conversations and inspiring others to take action, you're doing it from a place of kind of some degree of understanding of what's happening in communities. Those are just a few suggestions off the top of my head. Thank you.
Romona, being in a climate denier state, how do you engage your communities and perhaps the politicians to work on these issues?
We engage through storytelling, telling the story, educating, bringing elected officials into the conversation, empowering residents through leadership development, so that they will be able to meaningfully engage and tell their story. So we use the power of storytelling a great deal. Another way is just making friends and inviting people into our homes and letting them see our communities. So many people, I mean, as you well know, Bob, you've been in this space for a number of years, and the environmental space has been predominantly white space, right? And so how do we connect with those folks who I refer to as mainstream environmentalists with grassroots folk who they may not even know that we exist, that we are the others to them. So bringing and sharing our story, inviting folks in to our communities, letting them understand that we want the same quality of life in our communities as everybody else wants. We don't want carbon emissions and black carbon breathing in because we have tractor trailers that are running 24/7 in our communities hauling timber, right? So what can we do in order to remediate some of this burden, as I believe Omar and Beto said, those communities that are bearing the brunt of climate change, we're not contributors to the climate change. So I think that's still something that we are all trying to think through. How do we get folks who would otherwise not give our communities a thought, but how do we put us on their mind? And when we get on their minds, then we will see them standing in solidarity with us and saying, we want justice.
Well, hopefully this broadcast will put all of you on everyone's minds and we can stand in solidarity. I want to thank our guests for joining us today. Where can our listeners go to learn more about your work? Romona?
We are in the process of developing our new website. Hopefully it's going to launch by the end of February, but you can always reach out to me directly at rft, as in Taylor, Williams at gmail.com. And my phone number is area code 314-363-5229. And we are more than happy to hear from you.
You're a braver woman than I am. I would never give my phone number out on the air. Omar, where can people reach you? Where can they learn about your group?
Yes, at our website, www.lam as in Mike, C, N as in Nancy, C.org.
Thank you. Beto?
Yeah, so yeah, you can reach us at my email, betomtz.lugo@gmail.com or at info@cankc.org, and our website is cankc.org. So my email, cankc.org is fine as well.
Thank you. Jacqui, where can people reach you in your group?
Thank you. So our website is the ChisholmLegacyProject.org. So just www.thechisholmlegacyproject.org. You can read about us there, and you can also sign up for more information, and the email will go straight to us all, and we'll get back to you for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Jellie?
Yeah, you can visit our website at www.LivZero, and that's LivZero.com, or find me on LinkedIn so we can connect.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour podcast at climategkc.org. That's climategkc.org. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.